So we have been working through Acts, the book of Acts, and for the past few sermons or past few weeks, we've been going through Stephen's defense, his sermon, his speech before the council. He is answering to charges of blasphemy against God, against Moses, against the temple. And we found early on in his sermon, he begins by claiming the God of glory, right? And that encompasses the fullness of the power and majesty of the Lord. It is the opposite of blaspheming God, Yahweh. And then he began to retell the story of the Jewish people. He starts way at the beginning with Abraham, the beginning of the promise, and he moves through Isaac and Jacob, and he arrives to Joseph and tells the story of how the Israelites came to be in Egypt, came to find themselves in this foreign land. And then we arrived at Moses, another beginning of a promise. And last week we heard the beginning of Moses' story, and we heard those building blocks of a story, the foundation of the story, the foreshadowing of a very similar, better story. Moses, who had been royalty, was made a lowly shepherd. And as a shepherd, he was brought to deliver the Israelites from the slavery that they had been in Egypt. And when Moses was Pharaoh's adopted grandson, he tried to save some Israelites. He tried to help his people, but the response that he received from the Jewish people, from the Hebrews at that time, it was an accusation. It was a retort. Someone asked him, "Who made you ruler and judge? Who made you ruler and judge over us?" And so Moses fled, and he fled to be a shepherd. And it was at that point, after being a shepherd, after being brought to a lower position in life, that God finally said, now come. Now I will send you into Egypt. So he was taken from that royal position, given an inconsequential position in life, and that is when God said, now you're going to engage. Now you're going to deliver my people. And that's exactly where we pick up in our text today. If you'd like to follow along, I didn't write the page number down. I believe it's 109 in the New Testament. We're in Acts chapter 7, and we're picking up in verse 35. Page 109 in the New Testament. Yes? Oh, good. I got that right. It says, "It was this Moses whom they rejected when they said, 'Who made you a ruler and a judge?' And whom God now sent as both ruler and liberator through the angel who appeared to him in the bush." Stephen repeats this Israelite retort. We had just heard it, but he repeats it again. Who made you ruler and judge? Moses had tried to take matters into his own hand when he was royalty. He tried to protect the Israelites on his own, out of his own idea, out of his own strength, out of his own power. But it was when he had no power at all, when he had no authority, no place, no position. That is when God called him into service. That is when God called him into delivering Israel from slavery. Moses, this lowly shepherd, was who God sent. It was not Moses, grandson of the Pharaoh, that God sent to help his people. It was the lowly shepherd. And notice here that Stephen not only repeats that descriptor from verse 27 when the Israelite questioned who made him ruler and judge, but Stephen adds in that God, when God sent him, he made him ruler and liberator, ruler and deliverer of these people. God sent Moses to deliver his people. The people had already rejected Moses, but God's call on Moses here, telling him to go now to Egypt, That's an endorsement. That's an endorsement from God for Moses. And the difference with Moses and the Israelites at this point from before, this point, Yahweh appointed him. He gave him a divine calling. And with that divine calling, because Moses was being sent by God, there was a supernatural power to this. There was a supernatural assurance that there would be deliverance, that this liberation of the Hebrew people would succeed because God was making it so. God sent someone to liberate the people. He led them out, verse 36, having performed wonders and signs in Egypt, at the Red Sea, and in the wilderness for 40 years. This is the Moses who said to the Israelites, God will raise up a prophet for you from your own people, as he raised me up. He is the one who was in the congregation in the wilderness with the angel who spoke to him at Mount Sinai and with our ancestors, and he received living oracles to give to us. I love how 40 years, the span of 40 years is covered in one sentence for Stephen. One sentence. A lot of signs and wonders happened in those 40 years. But he just kind of skims past it because that's not the greater point. The details are not what Stephen is concerned with poring over. Last week, we heard about the story that was similar but better, and the foundations of the story. The royalty became shepherd. Shepherd was sent to rescue the people. Today, we're adding into that story. We're adding in the character typology. That's beginning to emerge to go along with those foundational blocks of this story. When we look at Moses, we see a man who had been rejected by the people. He became a ruler. He delivered the people, and time again, with signs and wonders, they saw this. He was a prophet. He mediated between God and humanity. He received and gave the words of life, and he was again rejected by his people. Do we see a similarity? Does it sound a little bit familiar? Stephen is drawing out the similarities of Moses and Jesus, painting the bigger picture for the council who he's delivering his sermon to. God raised up Moses to bring the people out of Egypt, to deliver them from slavery. Moses delivered the people. He worked signs and wonders. He brought them through the Red Sea. He prayed and had manna and quail for the people. He received the living oracles for the people. The living oracles are the law. We all know Moses came down with the law. He received the living oracles from God to give to the people. He mediated between the Father and the people. He told the Israelites that God would raise up a prophet like himself, and he did. Just as God raised up Moses, God would raise up Jesus. Moses was not the end of the promise to Abraham. Moses was the beginning of the promise to all people. He was not the end. And what's so fascinating is that the promised prophet that Moses said Yahweh would raise up, the prophet that the leaders of Israel would have been looking toward, looking to, seeking all this time, that is the very man that the council, that the leaders of Israel had killed. It was Jesus. So Stephen is sitting here telling the story of his people, telling the story of Moses, speaking the history to the leaders, reminding them exactly who they've been looking for. And it was the man who they had just killed. Here, Stephen is paying great respect to Moses and to the living oracles, to the Torah. He's doing the very opposite of what he was accused of. He is not blaspheming Moses, the very people he brings defense to, the defense before. They're the ones that killed the promised prophet, the promised deliverer. The Israelites had the oracles of God, the law of God that was given to them through the prophet Moses. The Israelites of Stephen's day had the very living word of God amongst them, living with them, teaching them. And what happened in both cases? Rejection. The Israelites in the wilderness rejected Moses. The Israelites in Stephen's day rejected Jesus. Verse 38, he is the one who was in the congregation in the wilderness with the angel who spoke to him at Mount Sinai and with our ancestors, and he received living oracles to give to us. Our ancestors were unwilling to obey him. Instead, they pushed him aside, and in their hearts they turned back to Egypt, saying to Aaron, make gods for us who will lead the way for us. As for this Moses who led us out from the land of Egypt, we do not know what happened to him. At that time they made a calf, offered a sacrifice to the idol, and reveled in the works of their hands. They were unwilling to obey the law. They were unwilling to obey the oracles that God had given them. They pushed Moses aside and in their hearts turned back to Egypt. They were released from slavery. They were free from the captivity that they had experienced, and yet they grumbled consistently in the wilderness. We'd be better off in Egypt. This is tough. We don't like this life. We want to go back. We want to be enslaved once again. And the story of the golden calf, it's a prime example of Israel's disobedience that led to idolatry, that led to unfaithfulness in God. In Exodus 32, we get that story of the calf. When the people saw that Moses delayed to come down from the mountain, the people gathered around Aaron and said to him, come, make gods for us, who shall go before us. As for this Moses, the man who brought us up out of the land of Egypt, we do not know what has become of him. Aaron said to them, take off the gold rings that are on the ears of your wives, your sons, and your daughters, and bring them to me. So all the people took off the gold rings from their ears and brought them to Aaron. He took the gold from them, formed it in the mold, and cast an image of a calf. And they said, these are your gods, O Israel, who brought you up out of the land of Egypt. They had just said the Moses that had brought them, led them out of Egypt. They didn't know where he was, so let's go ahead and make some gods. Hey, this is the God that led us out of Egypt. When Aaron saw this, he built an altar before it, and Aaron made proclamation and said, tomorrow shall be a festival to the Lord. They rose early the next day and offered burnt offerings and brought sacrifices of well-being, and the people sat down to eat and drink and rose up to revel. How quickly they forget. Aaron was Moses' right-hand man. He was a leader of the people. He was a leader of the chosen people of Yahweh. He was the deliverer of the word along with Moses. And how quickly he snatches the rings to make a god. Here we have the most significant incident of rebellion against God by Israel, as retold by Stephen. The people rejected Moses based on a delay of coming down the mountain. They didn't know where he was. They weren't sure. So immediately, they make a god for themselves. Little g, God. The people rejoiced in the works of their hands. They reveled in the gods they made for themselves. We all know that the wilderness period, this is a time of ebb and flow for the Israelite people. They are devoted to God and they rebel against God. They're devoted to God and they rebel against God for 40 years. And how did God respond? But God, this is verse 42, but God turned away from them and handed them over to worship the host of heaven. As it is written in the book of the prophets, did you offer to me slain victims and sacrifices 40 years in the wilderness, O house of Israel? No, you took along the tent of Moloch and the star of your god Rephan, the images that you made to worship, so I will remove you beyond Babylon. That's a way of saying, you do what you want. You do what you want. God let them go their own way. And what happens when people go their own way? When left to themselves, people will self-destruct. They will head down a self-destructing course. The Israelites sought anything that they could worship, anything that might lead them. But the pattern of idolatry led them to national judgment. They were enslaved again. They were hard of heart again. They found themselves captive in a foreign land to foreigners. The story of the Israelites that Stephen recounts before the council is the story of his people. It's the story of the Jewish people, but really and truly it's the story of all people, because people, whether Jew or Gentile, whether Texan or New Yorker, people, when left to themselves, will follow a course of self-destruction. We are not far off from the ancient Israelites, are we? Think about this. Who remembers their small catechism? No hands? Okay, some hands. Who remembers the first commandment? You shall have no other gods. And what does this mean? That we should fear, love, and trust God above anything else. But we too build our own golden calves. We sacrifice a lot to the idols that we make for ourselves, and we revel in the works of our hands. We sacrifice our bodies to the idol of perfect physique. We sacrifice our families to the idols of extracurriculars or good jobs that take us away from the home time and time again, hour after hour. We sacrifice our babies to the idol of choice and personal freedom. Moses freed the Israelites. He freed them. And what did they do? Pushed him aside. They pushed him aside. They rebelled against their deliverance only to turn their backs and turn their faces towards captivity once again, to the place they were enslaved. They built false gods. They built idols for themselves. Brothers and sisters, every single week we are set free. We hear that Jesus Christ has delivered us. He has broken the bonds of sins that have enslaved us, and yet so quickly we push him aside and we turn our hearts back to Egypt. We turn looking for that captivity that we are so accustomed to. The beauty in all of this is that Yahweh knew. He knew his people would self-destruct. He knew they would turn back and rebel. He promised through Moses that he would send a prophet, that he would raise a prophet amongst them, a prophet who would be greater than Moses, a ruler and a liberator for all people. God knew his people would rebel, and God knew that we too would rebel. But he also knows that we can't free ourselves. And so he raised up for us, for all people, the final ruler and liberator. We confessed this very morning that we are captive to sin, that we are in bondage to sin and cannot free ourselves. And what is the response? That God, in his mercy, has given his Son to die for us, and for his sake forgives us all our sins. You are set free from the captivity of sin. You are set free from that bondage, and it no longer holds you enslaved. Moses led the Israelites out of a physical enslavement. He delivered the living oracles to the people of Israel, but they still built their idols. They still wanted someone to lead them, to go before them. We have been led out of our spiritual enslavement by Jesus Christ. He has set us free. He is the living word that God has sent to us. We have no need to seek someone to go before us because we have Jesus Christ himself, the second member of the triune God. He has already led the way to the Father. He led the way when he poured his blood out upon the cross. He led the way when he was raised from the tomb. He led the way when he ascended to the Father, and he will lead the way when he comes again in glory to judge the living and the dead, when he comes to gather all unto himself. In his own words from the Gospel of John, he said, "In my Father's house are many rooms. If it were not so, would I have told you that I go to prepare a place for you? And if I go and prepare a place for you, I will come again and will take you to myself, that where I am, you may be also." Our place with the Father is prepared. Jesus Christ has gone before us. He leads the way to the Father. He leads the way to everlasting life. The way is completely cleared and wide open for you and for me through Jesus Christ. This day is Christ the King Sunday. And we celebrate Christ as our ruler. We celebrate Christ as the King of all creation. What a fitting day when we're hearing about the people, the liberators that God the Father had sent, all leading up to the true King, to Christ the King. And we can rejoice wholeheartedly because God did not just send Moses. God did not just send a physical deliverer. God sent the ultimate deliverer, the ultimate liberator, the ultimate ruler in his Son, Jesus Christ, who goes before us always.